Hello, and welcome everyone to the next session in our community table training series, sponsored by Anthem Medicaid. And we are so thankful for Anthem Medicaid partnering with us to be able to provide this training opportunity for homeless service providers across our community and across the Commonwealth. Today with us, we have Miss Cindy Manginelli with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. And today we're going to be talking about client-centered homeless services. Cindy, we'll go ahead and let you take it.
Yeah, it's really good to be with you all again. We've conducted a few, or actually, I guess at this point, several different trainings with you all. So hopefully some of you have attended some of the others and you're familiar with the council, but the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council is a national training and technical assistance program. We provide educational resources, webinars, publications, toolkits, online courses now, policy work, advocacy work, all kinds of things like that at the intersection of healthcare and homelessness. So if you are not familiar with the council, I would encourage you to check out our website. You can see the address there at the end of my email address, and that is my email address at the bottom of the screen. I am happy to talk more about any of the things that we're going to talk about today. If you have questions or comments or ideas, please feel free to reach out and email me and let me know that you went to this training so I'll know what it's relevant to, but I'm happy to talk more. We have a huge amount of information to cover today. We're going to do a really broad overview of client-centered homeless services. And this is the list of things we're going to go down, not in this order. But we're going to talk about what does it look like as we engage clients? What does it look like to keep the client's desires, the client's goals, the client's personal strategies in mind as we engage them? My background is primarily in direct services. I'm a crisis counselor by training. I worked in ministry for many, many years, and then I worked as a children's counselor in a domestic violence shelter, director in a detox unit, and a halfway house for women coming out of incarceration, a drug treatment program, and a clinic for refugees and immigrants, working specifically with people who were uninsured. So lots of work around that. And then a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to come out of that, but also out of our national work here at the council and just different programs that we've engaged around these different topics. I imagine that we're going to take pretty much the full hour. I would really encourage you to use the chat, though. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, but I would encourage you as we're talking, if there are questions you have or things, examples that you have, things that have worked well for you under one of these topics, feel free to put that in the chat. Like I said, I'm not necessarily going to be reading it because I'm going to be going through here, but I would encourage you to put in anything that you think you could learn from each other around these topics, and feel free to use that as sort of a way of talking to each other. Feel free to introduce yourself there as well. And if you can think of things around these topics that you think might be beneficial to the overall community of people watching, please feel free to use it that way. I worked with a young woman several years ago. This is not her. This is a placeholder picture, but just a stock photo. And I'm not going to use her real name either, but her name was Gladys. And Gladys had been episodically homeless since she was 17. I was doing some crisis counseling for some area churches, and they connected me to her, and her family had just kind of abandoned her. Honestly, her father had just kind of run away after a long series of negative circumstances and abuse, and had abandoned the family. Her mother had returned to Kenya, which is where she was from. She was struggling with some mental health issues. When I first met Gladys, she was kind of curled up in the laundry room of the apartment complex where they lived. And she had received a notice on her door saying that they were going to be evicted. Of course, her parents were gone, and she knew she couldn't pay the bills, but she had misunderstood the notice and thought that she'd already been evicted. She hadn't even tried to turn the key, and she just thought she was locked out. And so she was curled up behind the washing machine. She did get evicted, and she was able to stay with a family. She was well connected to a local church, and that's how I had met her. And she was able to stay with some different families, and she kind of did a lot of couch surfing. She was one of those people, well, she still is, but she was one of those people that when she was happy, she just lit up a room. I mean, she has the most beautiful smile, the cheeriest personality. Everyone that talks to her smiles. But when she was having hard days, she could just do what she did that day and just kind of curl up. And it wasn't bipolar or anything clinical like that. She just, like all of us, she had good days and she had bad days, but just a beaming personality. But she did struggle with depression sometimes. And so she ended up going into a residential program for depression and also to help learn some life skills and things. And she graduated from that. She was there for about a year, went to live with the family. And after a few months, the family reached out to me and said, she's on the bed. She doesn't get up. We don't know what she's doing. She hasn't gotten a job. She's not paying her rent. She had all these goals when she came to live with us. She's not doing any of them. And we think that she's smoking marijuana. And they were a foster family. And so their family was highly scrutinized by the state because they had foster children in and out. And they said, she cannot stay here if she's using marijuana because we'll lose the foster children. So I got in the car and I drove over there to meet with her. And the whole way there, I just know what I know I'm going to say. Look, you've just spent a year learning coping mechanisms. You've just spent a year figuring out how to take care of yourself. Now you've got to use these skills. You've got to get a job. You've got to get housing. I had this whole speech pretty frustratedly prepared in my mind that I was going to drive up and deliver to her. Fortunately, when I got in and was in the same room with her, she started talking before I did because I was ready to just, I've done this for a long time, just like many of you. And even without realizing it, I can be pretty sure that I know what people need. That sounds terrible. But I've worked with a lot of people. I've navigated a lot of systems, just like many of you. And you just kind of know, all right, you've gotten housing. Now you've got to do this, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do this. And this is the phone call you've got to make. And this is the website you've got to visit. And you need to go here and stand in line. And we just kind of know this is what you have to do, right? And so I was prepared to go in and just say, this is what you've got to do. But I get in there and she says, I asked her how she was doing. And she said that she had to get her driver's license and, that she was just adamant she had to get her driver's license. And I was just like, that's absurd. That's an absurd use of your time. You don't have money for a car. You've never been able to pass. She tried 3 times before and had never been able to pass the driver's test. You can't afford insurance. You can't afford gas. It's just like, what are you thinking here? Fortunately, I talked to her a little bit longer and discovered that she had gone to apply for jobs. She was wanting to get her associate's degree in early childhood education, and she had gone to apply at some preschools, and they had told her she needed her driver's license. What they actually meant was you have to have a valid Tennessee ID. And that had just stopped her, because she thought, I've got to get a driver's license or I can't meet any of my goals. When we talked for a while and I looked through the paperwork she'd been given, it turned out she didn't have to have a driver's license. She just had to have a valid Tennessee ID. It was a little trickier because she was an immigrant, but we were able to do that. Within a few months on her own, she got a job. She applied for an associate's degree program and was accepted. 6 months later, she had her own apartment and she was living independently. A year later, she was ready to buy her first car. I tell that story because as we're talking about client-centered services, as I engaged Gladys, I was very certain I know what you need to do. I've worked with you in the past. I was very certain that I knew everything about her and that I knew her past, her present, and I knew what she needed to do for her future. I would not have said it that way, but that is in essence what I thought. And very often I think that is how we engage our clients. We come to our clients sometimes because of the pressure that we feel to check certain items off a list or to meet certain outcomes or to document certain results. Sometimes just because we've done this a long time and we really feel like we know what's best for people. But we come to our clients with, this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to do it. And when we talk about client-centered homeless services, what we're really talking about, and we're going to talk about this in several different ways today, is we're really talking about coming to the client with curiosity. Who are you? What do you want to do? What's been your past? What are your goals for the future? And I think even as I say that, probably some of you are rolling your eyes and going, I cannot have that kind of conversation with the 50 clients on my caseload, right? And I totally get that. But certainly we can come with some level of curiosity and at the most basic level, believing that we don't know what's best for everyone. That the person that I'm helping is an independent, autonomous, adult, and that they know what is best for them and that I do not. And so that as I approach a client, I need to find out from them, what would you like help with? That my question, that as I approach a client, my posture is not, here's what you need. Here's what you have to do. Here's your solution. As I approach a client, my question is, how can I help? What are your goals? What are your desires? What can I do to help? And then having a really good understanding of what I can do to help and what I cannot, right? If what they need help with is not something that my agency does, I understand that, I'm comfortable with that, and I'm able to make a referral. If what they would like help with is something that we do, then we talk together about how I can support them. This is really, in some ways, a revolutionary way of thinking about how we engage our clients. We're seeing the field move more and more this way, but 20 years ago, this wasn't what we did at all. We really expected clients to come in and we told them, this is what we do, this is what we can do for you. Here's what you have to do, complete this paperwork, go to this group, have this meeting, jump through these hoops, and then you will have reached the goal we have for you. And we're trying with client-centered services to really think about this very differently. And instead of us telling clients what they need and who they are and how they should do it, that we look at each client individually and say, what do you need? How can we help? These are the services we provide. Are these services helpful to you? And in what way can we provide these services in a way that supports you? It really is about treating our clients as autonomous adults. As a society, we tend to look at someone who is in poverty, someone who's has poor personal hygiene, someone who uses substances, someone who has mental health issues or difficulties with their mental health, or their mental health is not consistent or what we would consider healthy. Even sometimes someone with a chronic disease or a chronic condition, we tend to look at them and automatically decide, because you're in that condition, because you're in that box, you don't know what's best for you, right? We tend to associate someone's financial success with their ability to make good decisions or their ability to know what they need. And in reality, those two things don't define each other, right? So training ourselves to look at someone who is in poverty, someone who's using substances, someone whose mental health someone who seems to be struggling with their mental health and still believing they are an independent, autonomous adult. They get to decide what's helpful for them. Now, we're not talking about when someone is a danger to themselves or others. Certainly someone can reach a point at which you have to say, what you're doing is going to really hurt you. It's going to kill you, right? So we need to have a serious conversation here. And sometimes, certainly, people can do things that causes them to lose the freedom to make their own decisions. That is certainly true. And we would be remiss to not say that. There are things that you do that mean, oh no, you don't get to make your own decisions anymore. But we tend to make that line way back here instead of way up here. You haven't bathed regularly, so you obviously don't know what's best for you. That's not true. But society has taught us to think that way. So in client-centered services, we're really thinking about this person as they are responsible for the decisions that they make. They are creating their own life, their own journey. How do I help them based on who they are and how they want to live? And sometimes that can seem really frustrating, especially if the way that they're living doesn't make sense to me, or I don't think it's safe, or I don't think it's what's best. But I'm still coming to that person saying, how can I assist? How can I help you as you decide who you are and what kind of life you want to live, right? So curiosity is really the basis of what we're going to talk about today. I approach my clients wondering who they are and what they need and how I can help. So one thing that we'll talk about here as we think about client-centered services is progressive engagement. So some of these are terms that are just kind of emerging in the field. Some of these are things that you've been talking about for years. Progressive engagement is one that I'm hearing a little bit more often, but that I'm not hearing all over the place all the time. And so even as the term is being used more frequently, I think it's also its definition is kind of growing as well. That's going to be the case for a couple of things we talk about today. There is some excellent information about progressive engagement on the website of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And if you're not familiar with the Alliance, I encourage you to check out their website. This is an infographic that they have prepared, and so you'll see where it is down there at the bottom of the screen. But they identify these 3 tenets of progressive engagement: flexibility, that it's targeted, and that it's efficient. The idea with progressive engagement is really very much of what I've just been talking about, that I don't come to a client and say, this is what you have to do and how you have to do it. But I listen to that client and I hear what they need. And I understand that the needs of all my clients may be different and that there's not a cookie cutter approach, right? We saw this with Gladys in the story I told earlier. When I came to Gladys as a 20-year-old, what she needed, who she was very different than she was when she was 17. And this is true of all of us, but this is particularly true of the demographic that we serve, because I may come to someone, especially if you're in an agency where you tend to work with some of the same people, I can tend to assume you need today what you needed 6 months ago, what you needed a year ago, what you needed last week, right? I can tend to see people and kind of prescribe where they're going and what they need and how that's going to work, instead of every time I talk to them saying, okay, what do they need now? What has changed? What has progressed? Maybe what's gotten harder. But each time I engage people, understanding that their needs may be different. And then also understanding that all of the clients that I meet, they each have different needs. And that's a big part of progressive engagement. Progressive engagement, we try to be very targeted. What is this person needing right now? What is their primary need? How can we meet that need? What are their greatest needs? What are the most costly needs that they have? Being more specific about how we target and prioritize the needs of each client. And this can be hard to do. If you work for an agency where the primary thing you provide is housing, then of course, every client that walks through the door, you're immediately thinking, okay, how do we get this person housed? And there are certainly lots of good reasons why we would think that way. Housing ends homelessness. A housing first approach that we're going to talk about in a little bit encourages us to think that way. But it does mean that everyone that comes in, I immediately start thinking, how can I get this person housed? Could they have a roommate? Will they fit into this unit? Do they have a family? Will they fit into this community? that everyone who comes in, I'm putting them in my which unit will they fit into box. And it can cause us at times to say, okay, I met with Frank, and Frank is going to really struggle to find housing. Frank has been housed 5 times. And every time he's left, or he's angered the landlord, or he's broken the rules. But here's Susie, and her toddler will be very easy to house because they have a great rental history and they have a support system, right? And so I just go, I think today I'll work with Susie, and Frank just keeps getting moved back down the list because I don't really know what I'm going to do with Frank, right? Even that language that I'm using, I don't know what I'm going to do with him, right? I prioritize people based on how easy they are to work with, or how well they fit into our system, or how well they work a program. Progressive engagement says I'm engaging everyone equally, of course, but I'm also thinking about, based on the resources available to us, who are those that have the fewest options, like Frank, right? Who are those that are really going to struggle with every agency they engage? How do we prioritize those? And that goes into the idea of efficiency. Of course, we're all in a position where we need more resources, but progressive engagement ensures that the most intensive and costly resources remain available to those with the greatest needs. When we talk about progressive engagement, or really any way that we prioritize people, of course, that's so tricky, because I've seen communities where those like Frank, who were the hardest to serve, were the last ones to get help. And then I've seen communities where only people like Frank were prioritized, and people like Susie were not prioritized because they would think, oh, Susie eventually, she's got her mom will help her at some point. She'll find something. So it feels to me like almost any system that we use to prioritize people can be inequitable and can be very subjective. We have to be really careful with that. But progressive engagement is primarily about how I engage the client. Am I engaging the client and recognizing that they have their own specific needs? And am I tailoring our approach based on their needs? And then we're going to talk about a strengths-based approach. Probably a strengths-based approach is something that you've heard. This is some terminology that's been in the field for a while. But the idea with a strengths-based approach is that we tend to address people based on their deficits. Really, our whole program is designed to do that. I mean, we're helping people because they're homeless, right? Or because they, because they're in extreme poverty. And so our whole system is based around identifying people based on their deficits. You're eligible for services because of what you don't have, right? And so we can tend to look at people and say, okay, you don't have any housing, you don't have any transportation, you have this chronic condition, what are we going to do? And the idea of a strengths-based approach is to look at people and say, okay, this person is seeking housing, right? This person is seeking this resource. What do they have that's working for them? What do they have? What do they do really well? And we can look at a strengths-based approach. We can look at we can use a strengths-based sort of framework in everything that we do. We can certainly engage our clients, thinking about their strengths. We can also think about our community, like what are the strengths of our community? What are the strengths of the different resources and referrals and partnerships that we have? What are our strengths? I encourage programs to take a strengths-based approach as they think about their staff and as they think about their agency. What do I do really well? What does our agency do really well? What does the health center that we partner with do really well? As opposed to, I think in this kind of work, we just tend to be fairly deficits based. And okay, what are we not doing? What are the gaps? What am I failing at? What is the health center really messing up on? And what is this other shelter that we refer to? How are they failing? We tend to be kind of negative. But and so I think there can be great value in using a strengths-based lens across the board. But when I think about engaging a client, so for example, I think about like Gladys that I talked about at the beginning. It was very easy to walk into that dark room and go, okay, she's not getting up. She's not eating anything but Cheetos and Mellow Yellow. She's not exercising. She can't pay her rent. The negatives were overwhelming. The negatives were certainly overwhelming for her. The negatives were overwhelming for the people who were trying to help her. The negatives were overwhelming for me as I walked in. So what does it look like to walk into that situation and say, what's Gladys doing really well? What's working for her? First of all, when we think about a strengths-based approach, we think about what is this person's success story? As we look at their whole life as much as we can, and I'm not saying we do a whole life story with everyone that we work with, but as I get to know this person, and hopefully we do try to get to know the people we work with, hopefully, again, there's that natural curiosity. Who is this person in front of me? What's their story? How can I help? So what has worked in the past? And that was really easy with Gladys. Sure, there were some really hard things in her past, but she had just finished a one-year residential program. That's a huge success, right? She had successfully worked a program. She had successfully identified goals for herself. That's huge, right? I can certainly look and go, wow, you had goals and you're nowhere near meeting them, but you have goals. And that's a big deal, right? It was to constantly remind her and to remind myself as someone who's trying to help her and support her, where have you succeeded and what's worked? And then to identify the external resources available. For Gladys, that was certainly the family that she lived with was a big external resource. If I had asked Gladys, so tell me about the people in the community that are here for you, she would have said her brother. She had an older brother. Her older brother when her father had abandoned the family, her older brother had sold the family home and kept all the money. And that the mom had gone back to Kenya and he had stopped paying the rent on the apartment. When I looked at Gladys's story, I looked at the older brother and said, he is making your life harder. He had applied for SNAP benefits and claimed that she lived with him so that he could get more SNAP benefits, and she couldn't get any. The older brother to me was not part of her strengths. But when Gladys identified her strengths, she always identified her older brother because she could call him in the middle of the night and he would listen to her, because she could celebrate holidays with him. And she could, if she saw him, he would give her a big hug. He was a big, strong guy and made her feel safe. So it's important with a strengths-based approach. And I find that this happens all the time. I talk to a client and they say, well, this goes well, and I'm good at this, and this person's always here for me. And I'm going, that person's made your life so much harder. And every time you go back to this place, things fall apart. But they identify it as a strength. And so again, client-centered interventions, we're looking at what does the client consider to be their strengths? And based on what the client considers to be their strengths, how can we make the best use of those strengths? How can we make the best use of what they consider to be their assets, their resources, even if you don't agree with that? Again, I'm not fixing anything. I'm not the solution to anything. I'm not the problem solver. I'm here to support you and to offer help to you as you figure out your life, as you solve your problems, as you make your plans. And so for me to say, this person's no good, don't talk to them anymore, that place has never been good for you, is not helpful. I'm here to help them. And then what are their internal resources? And we sometimes forget this, but it can be huge. Gladys was extremely friendly. She interviewed very well. She was very good with children. She also had developed coping mechanisms, like she could draw. She journaled a lot. She had friends that she could call, and she was able to explain to her friends when she was sad and why she was sad. She was passionate about working with young children, and she was very good at it. So what are those internal resources? Can we kind of call those out of our clients, recognize them, help them to see the tools they have in their toolbox? I'm not giving them a toolbox full of my tools. I'm saying, what do you have at your disposal? And I'm really pointing those out to them regularly when we engage. Another method that we're going to talk about briefly is critical time intervention. Critical time intervention, this is a phrase that's being used more in the field, and it's being used more as a description of services that are centered on helping recognizing that when someone is leaving incarceration or leaving institutionalization, there is a very narrow window of the amount of time when they will actively engage with service providers. Now, of course, that's not true across the board, but that in general, once someone is in incarceration or they're institutionalized and the date for their release is coming and they know it and their community knows it, there's a limited amount of time before that person will just tend to kind of disappear if they don't receive help. And then, of course, if they do kind of disappear, then recidivism, things like that are more likely to occur. So the term critical time intervention is being used in some ways very generally to mean we need to develop strategies that recognize the key times in someone's life or story where they are most likely to engage service providers and they're most likely to receive help. And then also recognizing that there are times in people's lives where they are much less likely to do that. And as service providers, to take advantage of that critical time when they are most likely to receive help or to engage social services. There is also a critical time intervention method. So that term is being used just to refer in general to the fact that we can identify critical times when we are most likely to successfully intervene. There's also a critical time intervention method that's very specific, and that's part of what I have pictured here. It's been very successful in some countries in Europe, probably somewhat because there's guaranteed housing in some countries in Europe, which means that the country will place you somewhere in many of those countries, homelessness is basically illegal. And so they will house you somewhere and you're expected to stay there. And so some of the barriers of just literally finding housing are eliminated or reduced. So I say all that to say, we use this term to mean a couple of different things, but there is an actual critical time intervention method that I've not seen really legalistically, exactly applied much here in the US. If you're using that actual model and you've had success, I would love to hear from you. But either way, what we do know for sure is that certainly when someone is leaving incarceration or institutionalization, if we can engage them well while they're still institutionalized or while they're still incarcerated and form a trusting relationship during that time, then if the same person who's going to be providing housing services can engage them at that time, then when they're released, we can begin more intensive engagement. And the hope here with the critical time intervention method is that as time progresses, the person becomes more stable and they require less intensive intervention. And that there may be, based on the population that you serve, ways of strategizing around this in conjunction with your Housing First model. So when do we first engage clients? Part of the idea of the critical time intervention strategy is that sometimes we engage a client, we realize this client either has just become homeless or they're going to be homeless very soon, like when I engaged Gladys. And then we say, okay, when you're actually homeless, then call us. Sometimes we even say, well, you're not really eligible for services until you've been homeless for a week or 3 nights or 3 months. And by that time, the person is in such crisis and they've experienced so much loss and so much disorientation that their need at that point is exponentially greater than if we had engaged them back here when they first became homeless or when they first realized they were going to become homeless. So there's some of the idea of diversion here. But is our model of case management or our model of intervention such that we don't really engage people until they are absolutely desperate? And that if that is the case, at that point, they require so much extra help. They require so much support, so much extra time and energy from staff that extra support is needed for a longer amount of time than if we had been able to really help them starting over here. And so it's just a challenge to kind of examine, when do we engage people, first of all, and I do work with a lot of agencies that have never thoughtfully stopped to consider, who are the people that we serve? Why are they homeless? When did they become homeless? Are most of the people that you're serving homeless because of a sudden crisis like domestic violence or bankruptcy or a family crisis? Or are most of the people that you're serving chronically homeless and they've been homeless for most of them, for years and years and years? And to strategically think about how you intervene based on that information. When would be the critical time to try to intervene and what would that look like? So those are all things to kind of think about. Again, a very broad view of critical time intervention. And all of these things, we're talking about low barrier services. Low barrier services, the idea with low barrier services is that there aren't lots of hoops that people have to jump through or lots of rules that they have to keep in order to receive help. This was a phrase that I started hearing probably about a decade ago. And when I first started doing this kind of work, most of the shelters, I'm calling from Nashville, most of the shelters here in our community, in order to get into shelter, you had to be drug-free, alcohol-free. You had to have somewhere to go during the day because the shelter was only open at night. You had to have transportation to get to the shelter. You had to be able to fit all of your belongings into a locker. You had to be able to sleep in a room. You had to be comfortable showering in just kind of an open shower with potentially maybe 50, 100 other people. You had to have the emotional stability and you had to have the emotional stability and, social skills to be able to sleep in a room with 600 people in a bunk bed. I mean, it was a lot. And so, there were many barriers to shelter, and certainly there were lots of barriers to housing. For most of those programs, for housing was the same way. For housing, sometimes it was harder. You had to have a job, you had to have, you had to be a traditional family unit, you had to be drug-free, alcohol-free. You get the idea. And so the idea with low barrier services is none of those things really matter or don't matter very much. How can we just get people in the door when it's cold? How can we just assist people who don't have anywhere else to go or who need our help? So we went from primarily in social services, this more high barrier model, to a more of a low barrier model. And there are issues both ways when we think about treating people as autonomous adults. When I was working in programs that were more high barrier, we looked at adults, 50-year-old, these were programs primarily for women. I would look at a 50-year-old woman and say, literally, you can't stay here unless your room is clean and your bed is made and you've cleaned up your dishes and you got to work on time. We had all these rules. I'm looking at a 50-year-old woman, giving her all these rules. Now, the other side of that spectrum can be that with some low barrier services, we're looking at a 50-year-old woman saying, well, you aren't locking your door. And, I had a case manager I was talking to a few weeks ago who said, I actually drive by the supportive housing unit of one of my clients who was a 50-year-old woman, and I lock her door every night because I know that she goes to bed intoxicated and she won't lock her door. Like, well, neither one of these models are we treating this person like an adult, right? Here we're saying you have to keep all these rules to receive help and we're going to treat you like a child. And here we're saying you don't have to follow any rules and we'll just come and take care of you and not treating you like an adult. And so there's issues on both sides of being low barrier and high barrier as far as being client centered. Remember, engaging people with the understanding of you have your life and your journey, and we're here to help. And I'm not going to make a bunch of rules that make it impossible to get help. And I'm also not going to start treating you like a child and erasing all consequences of everything you do. But based on your lifestyle today, how can I help? And this comes around the desire to provide services for individuals, regardless of how they're living or the choices that they're making. What services do we provide? What kind of help do we offer? And are there people that, if there are people that we really say, okay, we really can't help if your life looks like this, what is that and why? And being very clear about that and being very intentional about that and having more of a mindset of these are the services that we provide. This is the help that we can offer, and not looking so much at, are you fit for that? Are you qualified for that? Do you deserve that? Not really looking at it that way, but just this is what we offer, kind of regardless of what you're doing or what lifestyle choices you make. And so I would encourage you to think about with your agency and with you, what are the barriers that do stop people from coming? And this can turn out to be a really tricky conversation. I've worked with agencies that said, wow, we did this thing to try to be more inclusive, and it kept other people from coming. And, what do we do with that? That can be a really tricky conversation of what skills, what sort of choices does someone have to be making in order to work our program? I was talking to a case, actually a nurse who works with people who are homeless. And she said, I realized that if you are absolutely high, I can't really help you. She had a program where they did an interview, and then she based on what that interview was, she would, decide what kind of services they need. And she said, it has nothing to do with substance use, or it's just, if you can't talk, if you're so high that you can't talk, or if you have a mental health issue that's so profound that you can't talk, or if you just can't talk and you don't sign and you don't have any way of communicating. Basically, she discovered you have to be able to communicate to me in order for me to be able to help you. And that's where she set the barrier. And that did keep some clients from being able to get help, because some of the clients that she engaged were not able to, because in her case, because of intoxication, they weren't able to communicate. So what can we do about that? How do we have meeting times? Right? But just identifying what are those barriers for us? What does someone need to be able to do? How do they need to be able to function to engage your agency as it is today, to engage you? are those barriers that can be mitigated? But as much as possible, what are the options available to our clients, and removing as many of those barriers as possible? For most agencies, that's looked like just actually removing rules, rules that kept people from being able to engage, rules from everything from how clean you have to be, to what hours you have to show up, to the mode of, whether you're on the phone or in person or email. But really looking at, are there rules and policies that keep people from being able to engage? Housing First is probably one you've talked about a lot. I think we've done trainings here on Housing First, but Housing First, of course, is the idea is for it to be a low barrier service. Again, that same idea that in the past, sometimes you had to maintain a certain kind of lifestyle, or you had to avoid certain behaviors or engage in certain behaviors in order to be housed. The understanding, the philosophy behind Housing First being that it turns out that most people, it's easier for people to get a job. It's easier for them to make decisions about their substance use. It's easier for them to make decisions about their mental health and to follow a certain treatment plan for those if they are housed, that those things are easier to do if you're housed. And so if you make those things barriers that people have to overcome in order to get housed, it's actually counterproductive. It's an approach to homelessness that prioritizes providing permanent housing to someone, and thus providing a platform by which other issues can be addressed. That housing is not dependent upon participation in a program, on being in recovery, on your physical health, on your mental health, but that we seek to help those who are seeking housing. We hope to get them into housing, as opposed to, and remove as many barriers to housing as possible. I work with a lot of agencies that are very committed to Housing First, but the referrals, the partners that they have are not. And so that can sometimes be, there are elements here sometimes that we can't control. Like, we work with this landlord and the landlord says, if you're going to be here, you have, the landlord has established barriers. Or we work with, this program and they say it has to be like this. And so sometimes we can adopt a Housing First model, and the partners that we have make it really difficult to adhere to. But just thinking about what those that we serve, what are our conditions for housing? And are those equitable? Are those realistic? Are those actually helping people succeed? Another part of Housing First that we don't talk about quite as much is that the basis of the Housing First model was really that clients would have more choice about housing and what kind of places they're housed in, where they're housed, the communities that they're housed in, and what kind of services they want to participate in. So if you're just taking someone and saying, okay, hi, nice to meet you, I'm your housing navigator, we have a unit 45 minutes away, that's where you're going to live, there you go. That even though you did prioritize their housing and get them into Housing First, they didn't have any, it wasn't client-centered, right? They didn't get to tell you their preference. They didn't get to have any participation in the selection of it. They didn't get to have any participation in what services would be available. And so what we're kind of doing now in the field is saying, okay, Housing First is a lot more than just the first thing we do is house you. And we're seeing there can be really negative consequences for just taking someone and sticking them in housing before you talk to them about anything else. Some agencies are applying Housing First and saying, we meet you, we see that you need housing, we house you, and we don't even talk about anything else. And that can actually be really detrimental. So again, client-centered services, even in a Housing First model, means it's not just I'm housing you first. I'm talking to you. What are your goals? What are your strategies? What are you looking for? What's helpful to you and what's not? And so we have seen Housing First models that really weren't client-centered at all, because people were being housed in ways and in places that weren't sustainable to them and that did not meet their goals at all. And so it was a waste of the case manager's time. It was a waste of the property because they ended up leaving, and it wasted the client's time, and it made them feel less housable, right? It was a fail for them, it felt like to them. So that is a poor application of the Housing First model. Housing First simply means we're not going to have the barriers there to housing. We're going to try to remove as many barriers to housing as possible. And the client is actually going to have more choice in their housing. But Housing First says we're not going to let substance use, mental or physical illness, the inability to find or maintain employment, the ability to work a system, or someone's willingness to commit to a program determine whether or not they get housing in some of its simplest form. I think we talk a lot about substance use and mental or physical illness as barriers to housing, but sometimes someone's primary barrier to housing is just they don't work a system very well. They don't go to all the meetings. They don't make all the appointments. They don't fill out all the paperwork. And it's amazing how difficult it can be to receive help, not because of a substance use problem, not because of a mental health issue, but just because you have a really hard time making yourself fill out all the paperwork, or you really can't stand those face-to-face meetings that you have to have with your case manager or your housing navigator. So that's a good thing to think about personally in the work that you do, but also in the way your agency functions, is to what degree do people have to be able to work our system in order to get help? And how is that a barrier? And again, Housing First prioritizes consumer choice and what resources and supports are most important to the client. If someone, I've worked with clients where it was really, really important to them that they be near the clinic where they receive dialysis 4 times a week. And if there was no way to express that to their housing navigator, there was nowhere on the form where they could put that, then that primary concern was disregarded. They were housed, but they were housed in a way that separated them from their primary goal, which was to get dialysis 4 times a week. And so there can be, it can be really important here to, again, maintain these client-centered services. The timing around Housing First, what to address when. Timing in Housing First is huge, because sometimes with Housing First, we get someone housed and then we go, okay, now they're good. They'll address everything else. And forgetting that second piece, that when someone is housed, then they may be in a better place to address some of their other goals. And sometimes once they're housed, they don't have the support needed to address those other goals. It's like, you're housed, you're good. We work with people who are homeless, you're no longer homeless. So how can we continue to provide the services that are helpful to the client? Allowing them to talk about and to be a part of figuring out where, how, when they're housed and what kind of housing. I'm not trying to be unrealistic here and say you sit down a client and say, okay, here's the map. Where do you want to live? And pick out what kind of apartment you want. None of us get to do that, right? That's not realistic. But if someone says to me, I have 3 children and having a yard is really important. Can we help them in that? Again, how can I help? Well, this is what we can provide. This is what we found. What do you think? I'm brainstorming with you. I'm coming up with ideas with you. I'm supporting you. I'm not making promises that whatever you want, we'll get. No one can do that. But here's what we do have. What do you think? As opposed to you here, right? As opposed to me sitting at my desk deciding who goes where. Certainly, we can't make everyone's dreams come true. That's not at all what I'm proposing. But based on the services that we can provide, I'm offering, I'm getting input, I'm supporting, as opposed to just, making all the pieces fit on my end. And then them talking with people about what supportive services that they need. And I really can't stress enough that if there are no supportive services, it is not Housing First. The Housing First model does not mean I stick everyone in housing and that's what we do first. And so we're good. These are the fears that people have around Housing First. And when we don't offer supportive services, they are very legitimate fears. I have seen individuals who, someone was homeless, they were put into housing and they died in housing. And they would have actually been safer in their camp, or they would have been safer in their shelter. But they were put into housing and no one asked, hey, what support are you going to get now with your chronic hypertension? What support are you going to get now? How are we going to help you support the 10 medications you need to take a day? And you had someone in the camp who was helping you with that. And you had someone in the shelter. But once you were housed, you didn't have that. And there's, 1,000 different ways that story could play out. So if you just house someone and say, okay, Housing First, low barrier, that's not really the Housing First model. But keeping in mind those with severe chronic disease, those with mental illness, who left alone that condition may be exacerbated. They may become escalated. Those with substance use disorder who are at a risk of overdose or relapse. Those desiring, they have very set goals like Gladys did. I want to get a job. I've got to get an ID. But if she didn't have any supportive services, that wasn't going to happen. And she was just quickly deteriorating. Her mental health was quickly deteriorating. All she needed was someone to help her with that one goal. So supportive services are a huge part of Housing First and a huge part of client-centered interventions, and keeping that in mind. And so I think it's just good to say, yeah, these are the criticisms of Housing First. We can address these. We can absolutely, and we need to. There are legitimate concerns here, but supportive services are how we address those concerns. The last thing I'm going to talk about is landlord engagement, which is a huge topic, and I'm going to just kind of breeze through it here as we conclude. I am really excited about landlord engagement. I've done a lot of trainings on this recently, and I think there's a lot of room for creative thinking around landlord engagement. I think it fits into this training on client-centered services because there are clients who come to us, first of all, and they're not actually homeless yet. Can we work with their landlord so that they are not ever homeless? Can that be part of our strategy? Is that diversion? And a good diversion strategy is always going to include landlord engagement. And then with Housing First, what does it look like to engage landlords? If someone comes to us and they know where they want to live, do they have any relationship there? Why do you want to live there? Who do you know there? Are there landlords there that we can engage? So keeping in mind a client's preferences, their desires, and then how do we engage those who actually do have housing in that area? When I talk about landlord engagement, I feel like a lot of times I can just see, eyes rolling back in the back of heads like, oh, you got to be kidding. But I have seen amazing things happen with landlord engagement. And very often, sometimes, I wouldn't say very often, but sometimes in client-centered engagements, if I talk to that client, I discover that they have relationships, or they're willing to talk to a landlord, or they have ideas, not always, but it's a possibility. So again, this is part of a bigger strategy, but if you're doing housing navigation, who are the landlords in your area? And if you don't know, how do you find out? How do you find out that information? But doing research to discover all these big apartment complexes or all these duplexes or townhomes, who owns those? You would be amazed at how many times you can discover, they're owned by someone who actually really is interested in the community. You do yourself a great disservice if you villainize all the landlords. And I think that is definitely what we have done in a lot of areas, is just decided the landlord is the bad guy. I hear service providers say awful things about landlords. I get it. We've had terrible experiences. There are landlords out there who want to help the community. I have worked with landlords who just bent over backwards. So who owns the properties around you? Again, we're approaching our clients with curiosity and without assumptions. Can I engage landlords without assumptions and with curiosity? Just wondering who owns this property. How do they feel about people who have a lower income? How do they feel about someone with a bad rental history? Can we help? So being willing to initiate those conversations. One of the biggest mistakes that I see agencies make when they're engaging landlords for the first time is they walk up with a brochure about their program. It's got a picture of someone who's homeless on the front, and they say, hey, I'm Cindy, and I'm working with such and such homeless shelter, and we help the homeless, and we want to put the homeless in your unit, right? And I present as someone, and what they think, because this is what everyone thinks in the community when they think about people who are homeless, is they're picturing that person on the side of the road who's talking to themselves, the most extreme situation. And they're thinking, you want to house people like that in my unit. And certainly we want to find housing for everyone. And even the things they believe about that person on the side of the road are not true very often, right? They may be. But they don't understand that homelessness can look like 1,000 different people with 1,000 different stories. And I've got so many people I'm working with with all different kinds of stories. And some of them would make awesome tenants. That's what I need to talk about when I talk to landlords. I need to help them understand who it is we're trying to help and see if they are also interested in helping those people. And very often they are. Very often they are interested in helping people. So how do I introduce who I am and what I do? And how do I discover, how do they feel? Are they interested in helping the community? Because you have a way that they can do that, right? So I identify the fears with these landlords. What are they afraid of? We often tend to think that they're most afraid of not having their rents paid. I find that's often not true. Often what they're most afraid of is damage to the unit that's going to cost them a fortune, that crimes will be committed in the unit, or that crime will increase on their property because they've housed someone that you're serving, that the rent won't be paid, and that neighbors, but this is sometimes the number one complaint I see from landlords, or fear, is that neighbors in the community will get mad at them because they're working with an agency like yours. So can you provide solutions to those fears? Can you say that you'll help monitor the property, or that there'll regularly be supportive service providers there who are assisting that person in maintaining their property? That you will help guarantee the rent or provide some sort of financial assistance? Can you partner with others in the community to help repair anything that's damaged? Can you promise to repair something that's damaged? Can you be on call? I work with agencies that are on call for landlords. And if the landlord has a concern, they can call, and that agency will go and check on the tenant there and try to help. Community engagement. Are there business owners that want to help your agency, that donate to your agency, that might be willing to work with a landlord? So Joe the plumber donates to your agency. Would Joe the plumber be willing to go and winterize units that landlords that lease out to people in your agency? And those partnerships can be complicated, and we don't have the time here to go into that. But I have seen agencies do amazing things in identifying the fears and then addressing those fears with landlords and using community partners to do it. Offering incentives like convening a landlord summit. This would be something more for the coalition or for COC. Doing a dinner for landlords where landlords' issues are brought up, honoring landlords in some way, publicly recognizing those landlords that work with your agency, promising to do property improvements, often with partners who are committed to your program, like we just discussed, or even just doing something like lawn care. So offering some sort of incentives. With all of these things that we talked about today, what I find is the number one barrier in all of these things that we talked about today often is that agencies like yours, or maybe you individually, you just get up and you serve the people who are right here, and you serve people all day, and there are 10 more outside that you didn't get to, right? And it's just all day is about survival. Housing, right? Meeting with people, getting people connected, getting people, and I work with so many agencies that are just in survival mode all the time. Who's the person here? What do they need? How can we do? This is what we help. This is where you go. Get the intake, right? And no one in the agency is dreaming about strategies like we talked about today. No one has time to, no one has capacity to. And so I would encourage you to think about that as well. Who are the people in your agency? How, in some level, does everyone in your agency take a step back and go, how do we approach our clients? How do we make them feel? Do they feel like independent adults? Do they feel like just kind of people move from point A to point B? What are our strategies based around that? For many of you, the primary barrier around all the things that we discussed today will be that, and that you don't have room to dream or examine or assess. And so if you hear some of these things and go, yeah, that all sounds great, but man, I've just got to see the 30 people waiting for me outside, or all of my staff are just busy, I would encourage you to kind of try to create some space for some strategizing, for some capacity building, for some assessing. And then in light of that, to think about how client-based are our services based on our discussion today. All right, and I will close out there. Any closing comments before we before we tune out today?
Sorry, just realized I was muted. My apologies. It looks like we just have a thank you, Cindy, for all of the great information. And I would just like to second that as well. It's always such a pleasure whenever you come and do trainings for us, Cindy. Thank you so much. Thank you again to Anthem Medicaid for making this presentation possible. And thank you to Cindy and the National Healthcare for the Homeless. As always, the recording will be listed on our community table website and on our YouTube page. And Cindy is always available for questions. If you all have further ones, we have her contact information, so don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.